So I'm new to this whole stage thing. We're just talking from my home office, so bear with me, but let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to talk about Premium Gen 2 and really focus on contrasting it with Azure Analysis Services. First of all, who I am. I'm Alex Dupler. I'm a PM at Microsoft. Originally, Alex Powers was supposed to join us today, but there was a little scheduling mix-up, and he's on a jet plane, so it's just me today. I work at Microsoft, but unlike most Microsoft people that you've run into this weekend, I don't work on any of the products. I work on an internal BI team. So in many ways, I'm a customer just like you. I just can ping Alex Powers directly when I have complaints, and sometimes he listens. So yeah, that's who I am. And Alex did Powers did most of the work on these slides, so I'm gonna give him a big shout out for doing that. We're gonna start with just why tabular models, because we've heard a lot this weekend, or at least I've heard a lot this weekend, people talking about don't use direct query. But why are we using tabular models at all? And the analogy that's been in my head recently is in an application, they've fallen in love with Redis caches and local in-memory caches that make your application faster. So there's a lot of ways in which the tabular model is just the Redis cache for your reporting. Sure, you could run all the queries on SQL Server, but you've got a pretty good idea what queries you're going to get, and so a caching layer makes a lot of sense. Additionally, the semantic model in Power BI is so much more powerful than SQL. So that's why tabular models. And now, the main focus of this talk is about Premium Gen 2 and why it really sets the stage for us to think of it as the solution 95% of the time versus Azure Analysis Services. Over the last 2-ish years, the Power BI product team has been working really hard on having Premium expand to cover all the scenarios that AAS used to cover. And at this point, they're pretty much there. I think there might be one thing left on Christian Wade's checkbox in query scale out. But other than that, and most people don't need query scale out. That's a pretty expensive solution. So that's what we'll be talking about. The key differences between Azure Analysis Services and Premium Gen 2 are about how the CPU is measured. So in Azure Analysis Services, you get 8 cores. And whatever you do with those cores, that's your problem. But in Premium Gen 2, you get the equivalent of 8 cores, but you run on a machine with 32 or 64 cores. I don't think the exact number is public. But your queries, individual queries, can go way more parallel and run way faster than they ever would on just those 8 cores. But that also means that you can use your 8 cores worth of time in just a few seconds. And so the throttling behavior works a little differently. The other really big difference between analysis services and all versions of Power BI is that in Power BI, models that aren't being used move out of memory, and the memory budget is on a per model basis. So whereas in AAS, if you get an S1, you have 25 gigs of memory for whatever you want to do. If you get a P1 in Power BI, you get 25 gigs per model. And there's no overlap at all. And so that's a huge difference in the model. And it's way more in your favor. The other big difference is, of course, that a Power BI SKU also licenses you to use Power BI for reporting. Whereas with AAS, you got to figure that out. Maybe you just use Excel. But hopefully, you're wanting to use Power BI, and so you're going to want some Power BI licenses anyway. So that makes the big differences. So let's talk a little bit about what this costs, what this looks like. There's a lot of options. If all your data is small, you only need 1 gig, you can just get pro licenses for everybody. Or get E5. Talk to your friends in security, and they're going to want E5 for other reasons, and it'll be great. If you need bigger models, you have the choice between Premium per user or Premium. And then just for comparison, we can see that the sort of equivalent SKU for AAS and how it's about a third the cost of Power BI. But again, you got to license Power BI. So once you add up those pro licenses, it's quite competitive. But the big difference is what I talked about before, where with your memory management, because models in Power BI, when they're not used, are loaded out, you can have as many QA models as you want. And when you're done with them, you just leave them. If you need to come back and check, like, hey, how does my changes compare to performance 3 versions ago? You just use it. It just works. It doesn't cost you anything. And so you can just do all that in Pro, and it's totally fine. Now, there's a lot of tools with the XMLA endpoint that you might want with Premium per user or Premium. But where things really get interesting is when you mix Premium per user with PPU. Because with Premium, you have a fixed CPU budget, and that costs you a fair bit of money. But in Premium per user, for just $20 a month for just your developers, and it's actually just $10 a month because they needed Pro anyway, you can have an unlimited dev test environment. And unless you need 100 gig models in test, it's basically free. And so one of the big things that I think Premium unlocks is it's been very tempting in the tabular space to really skimp on the test environments and not have full-size test models, not be set up to really test things before you deploy. And with Premium per user, that becomes a no-brainer. So that's really the big thesis of this talk, is that Premium per user plus Premium gives you a developer testing experience that, I mean, we looked at with an S1, yes, if you double the cost, it's still a little cheaper than a Premium, but if you're at bigger SKUs, you just have a few developers, it's really, really cost effective. So that's this. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that while in PPU, in some ways, you're not comparing it with a P1 or an S1. You're actually comparing it with a P3, because you can have, in PPU, data sets, the data set can't literally be 100 gigs, but you've got 100 gigs of memory to work with. And on my team, we've been using an A6 for a long time, even before PPU, and we found that we could go safely about 60% of memory, 65% of memory before we started to really have problems. That did require us spending time thinking about incremental refresh. If you didn't want to worry about that, 45% would be a good rule of thumb. But that's in a P3 or in PPU, you're getting way more than you would get with just that P1. Now, not everything about PPU is the same as just straight up Premium at the P3 level. There's a little bit of differences, but for the most part, things are, the things you care about, it's a lot like running on that P3, including the number of cores that can run individual queries. So the last topic that I really wanted to hit on here is, we've talked a lot about comparing them apples to apples, where, okay, I could either choose Premium per user, or I could either choose a flavor of Premium, or I could choose AAS. But the reality is that for the last several years, AAS hasn't seen any of the new functionality that we've gotten in Premium. And as a result, you may not care about all these features. You may not need paginated reports. You may not want your data flows to run the enhanced compute engine. But I bet for every single one of you, there's at least one of these features that's a big deal, makes a big difference for you. Maybe it's hybrid tables. Maybe it's incremental refresh. Maybe you've never written partition management for AAS and you don't want to learn. Well, incremental refresh in Power BI will just do it for you. So in some ways, this is a bigger deal than all the stuff we talked about free test environments. Because in Premium, we have all these new features. The list is constantly growing. Whereas I think the last thing AAS got was calculation groups. I don't think they've really gotten any features since then. So, you know, that is a really big difference. So at this point, we've gone about 10 minutes. Are there any questions before I go any further? Yes.
I just got to say, with PPU,
Mm-hmm.
how does the licensing work in terms of who needs to have a PPU license to view derivatives of PPU content?
Yeah.
So PPU on data flows, PPU data sets, if you've got those in workspaces,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got fin reports in another workspace, what's the licensing requirement for those fin reports?
Yeah. So let me just repeat the question here. With PPU, what are the license requirements if you have content in a PPU workspace and then you want to build content off of it? How does that have to be licensed? So PPU is licensed a lot like Pro in that basically everybody who's going to access content that's leveraging PPU has to have a PPU license. So if you have a data set in a PPU workspace, the reports built off of it need to be built by and consumed by people with PPU licenses. So one approach, the approach that Microsoft has taken internally, is just everybody has a PPU license. Now, that can be an expensive solution. If your company is under, I think it's 250-ish employees, that's the cheapest solution. You should just do that and don't even think about it, and it's a no-brainer. If you're more than that, it can be an expensive solution, but once you start to add up, like, okay, how many SKUs do I have, how many, for the number of reports I'm running, how many capacities do I need? Now I am starting to need to manage memory. I think there's a strong argument that PPU makes sense for much larger organizations. Microsoft, we did it because we can do whatever we want with our software. But it's been a really great experience for us internally, not really having to worry about, okay, this model needs to be on this capacity, and these models, they need to be on a separate capacity. It's just, everything works. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So you suggested using the Power BI Premium per user as a dev test
Mm-hmm.
environment, but you also showed a graph that showed that it's actually quite different from the P1.
Yeah.
So how do you estimate whether, when you've been developing something, how this is actually going to perform in your actual production environment?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, how, if you're using PPU as your dev test environment, but in PSKUs, the way, like, you have a different amount of cores available. How can you be sure that the performance is going to be the same? The answer is there's sort of three parts to this. One, most of your development and your testing, that doesn't matter, right? Most of the time, whether you're testing that the measures are correct, the data is good, the model is correct, you don't necessarily need exactly the same performance characteristics. Two, if you do want to get cheap, like-for-like performance without impacting prod, you can spin up an A SKU for however long and do a single test just on that A SKU. Move that workspace into the A SKU, run it for an hour, move it back off. However, if you want to do a actual real-world load test with your actual users, that A SKU isn't going to necessarily license you for the users to access that report. So the only way to do real-world performance testing is to put that on your actual capacity, your production PSKU. But again, because we have multi-model memory management, if you put an extra model in a workspace or create a user acceptance workspace that's on the PSKU, run it for however long your test takes, and then just revoke the user's access, and it didn't cost you anything. Whereas, now, there may be some contention between the two models. You might have to figure out a strategy for that. But Whereas in the AAS space, you'd have to delete it from the capacity and maybe even create a whole nother capacity and pay the full freight for the time. It's similar to using the ASKU, but yeah. Any other questions in the back? Thank you.
Just to follow on to that person's question,
Yeah.
there are scripts you can use that simulate load on capacities. So you give it a report and it says tested like 1,000 people are using it, and you can see the performance.
Yeah. So this fellow points out that there are load testing scripts that you can do to run against to try and get a sense of what the performance will be. Now, there were some of those scripts that were released targeted towards Gen 1, and I think with Gen 2, they're a little less applicable. And I don't know that there's anything super great out there right now for load testing Gen 2. Part of it is that because it's a shared resource, if you're really going to try to push it, Microsoft might not entirely like that. I don't think anybody's out there saying don't do it, but I think that's perhaps why they haven't been falling over themselves to provide new scripts. Any other questions? Oh, okay, yes?
What about businesses who use pausing in Azure analysis services?
Yeah, so what if you're pausing your capacities? That is an area where with the premium SKUs, you don't have an analog. The business that I work in, that's never really been an option. But if that's a direction you want to go, you can also look at ASKUs and building out embedding code and just embedding all your reports into a portal. I think there's a couple of folks that have built out setups like this. Like I know Mike Carlo likes to talk about his embedding portal that they've built out that they give to customers. And you can just use the ASKU. As long as then you're managing it through an embed portal where you're doing the auth, the ASKU would work fine. And then you could start and stop. A little bit more work up front, but could be worth it. Another question.
So I've seen some solutions out there
Yeah.
that basically do what you were just talking about, have an ASKU and then use Power BI embedded
Yeah.
to give people access to content.
Mm-hmm.
So actually organizations, if we're a consultancy, we can actually say, we'll host your content, give you as a client access using Power BI embedded. And then it's an incredibly cheap way to license to customers.
Yeah.
Like, is that against Microsoft licensing rules, or is that actually...
Yeah, so the question is, if you're building this portal where you're distributing content on like your own web portal using ASKUs, is that against Microsoft licensing? And the answer is no. If you have an ASKU, any place you embed reports, as long as they're using your own auth stack and not an AAG, like your tenant, you should be covered. And I know that like Inka Feldman has built out, she talked about how they built this out on the Raw Data podcast. I know that, like I said before, Mike Carlo's done this. Like there are definitely people that are using this, talking about it. I don't think there's anybody that's selling like a SaaS solution or has on GitHub like a framework where you can just do it. Maybe, but I haven't seen it. So, yeah. We've got 1 minute. So, any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Let me put up, there was a couple things we didn't really talk about, but sort of off topic. So thank you. And I really appreciate all the questions. Don't forget to provide feedback. And yeah.